All right, folks, with this video, what we're going to cover are biological macromolecules. So in terms of biology, something that is important and relevant to biology is going to be chemistry, which always disappointed me as a student because chemistry was one of my least favorite subjects. What we're going to stick to here, though, are the parts of chemistry that are relevant to biology, all right? And that part that's relevant to biology are going to be the macromolecules. And this is true for prokaryotic cells as well as eukaryotic cells. In terms of those macromolecules, we've got 4 classifications of macromolecules. We're going to have carbohydrates. This pen is squeaky, so I'm going to get a different one to do the next colors. All right. We've got carbohydrates. We've got lipids, which are fats. We have proteins. And then we have the nucleic acids. Okay? In terms of microbiology, carbohydrates are going to be important. We're going to talk about how those carbohydrates or tags on the outside of the bacteria are actually going to be in part what your immune system recognizes in order to recognize those bacteria as being foreign and have your immune system take care of them. All right? So carbohydrates are going to be important. The lipids and the fats are going to be important because those lipids and fats make up the cell membrane of our prokaryotic cells. Proteins are going to be super important, all right? Because with those proteins, essentially that's what our enzymes are going to be. Our enzymes are proteins. Those proteins then, or those enzymes, are going to run a lot of the chemical reactions. We're also able, with bacteria, to use the enzymes that those bacteria produce in order to identify the type of bacteria that we have, okay? Nucleic acids, always important. If you don't have nucleic acids, you don't have something living, okay? Those nucleic acids we'll talk a little bit about are going to be RNA and DNA, okay? So in terms of the macromolecules, all right, those carbohydrates are going to be the sugars. And in terms of those carbohydrates, there will be different carbohydrates on the outside of bacteria that I want you to be familiar with. I'm going to point those out in some later videos. But for right now, carbohydrates are going to be one of our macromolecules. We're talking about sugars, okay? We've got some different types of sugars that are out there as carbohydrates. But I'm going to kind of address that a little bit later when we get to the markers on the outsides of bacteria and how that can signal a bacteria as being pathogenic. All right? So in terms of that, the 3 I'll kind of focus on here are going to be the lipids, the proteins, the nucleic acids. All right? In terms of that, our lipids, primarily what we're talking about with microbiology, we're going to talk about the phospholipid. All right? That phospholipid is going to make up the cell membrane. And in terms of that phospholipid, it's going to have 2 main components to it. Okay? I drew the circle here. That circle is going to be our phosphate. The phosphate is going to be polar. Therefore, the phosphate portion is what's known as hydrophilic, meaning it's attracted to water. All right? The squigglies I drew here, we'll go over them in another color just to make them a little bit different. All right? The squigglies there are going to be a long chain of fatty acids. All right? And in terms of those fatty acids, they can be either saturated or unsaturated. All right? You may be familiar with those two terms when you talk about fats that you may take in as part of your diet. The saturated fats are the ones that are bad for you to take in, or in terms of that, because essentially what it is it's two long carbon chains. And because you've got two long carbon chains there, those carbon chains can pack in tightly together, and you can get a lot more of those molecules to pack in and stack on each other. All right? So in terms of that, when we're talking about diet, saturated fat is the bad one for us. Unsaturated fats are the better fats. The unsaturated fat, all right, if our saturated fat, you've got kind of a straight line there, the unsaturated fat is going to kind of have a kink in it, all right? And in terms of our phospholipid, I know I drew this up, but now I'm going to erase just a little bit, all right? That's essentially what we've got. We've got a kink in that lipid tail associated with the phospholipid. That's an unsaturated fat. So this one here would be saturated, this would be unsaturated. What that does is that allows the membrane to be fluid. All right? So in terms of that, if I'm going to draw here a cell membrane, so we've got some circles. We've got our fatty acid chains, and I do the wiggly lines just because it's faster to draw, all right? But each of these would contain a saturated and an unsaturated fat, all right? So in terms of that, the way things are going to orient, you're going to have like things wanting to be together, all right? And the blue bit I'm going to draw in here, we're going to put a protein in our cell membrane, okay? And in terms of that, remember the head is going to be hydrophilic. There's a different term for the tails, all right? Those tails, those saturated and unsaturated fats are hydrophobic, okay? And if we go on looking at the name here, anytime you see hydro, we're talking about water, all right? If you have a fear of something, you have a phobia. So phobia means essentially fear, all right? So in terms of that, that inner part of that phospholipid membrane is hydrophobic. Water doesn't like to go there. And that's okay, because in terms of our environment, we have our water out here, we'll have water on this side of the cell membrane, and those polar heads are good with that hydrophilic environment. So in terms of those phospholipids, the reason why they orient themselves into what's called as a bimolecular leaflet, bimolecular, so you've got two layers, all right, of those phospholipids, is because of the chemical properties associated with the phospholipid itself. All right? So that phospholipid actually is what's known as amphipathic, meaning it has properties both that are hydrophilic and hydrophobic. Okay? So in terms of our lipids, that's kind of the basic review I want you to understand as far as membranes. Remember, when we're talking about later on things getting across a cell membrane, those properties of hydrophobic, hydrophilic are going to become important again, because that's how molecules can pass through the membrane, okay? Because like tends to associate with like. So things that are hydrophilic are going to associate with water. Things that are hydrophobic are going to associate with fats, all right? Thank you for your attention. The next video I'm going to talk about is a little bit of review of protein and protein structure.